You are listening to Radio SGN. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the second episode of SGN Out Loud, a new service of the Radio SGN network. I'm Madison Jones, managing editor of Seattle Gay News, and we're so glad to have everybody again today. For this episode, we're going to be speaking with Glen Stellmacher, who wrote a very amazing investigative piece in our most recent August issue. Glen, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So before we hop in today and talk about the piece, I just wanted to ask if you would be able to just introduce yourself to the folks out there who are unfamiliar with your work.
Sure, yeah. So I am an investigative reporter, and I really started doing this kind of work after the 2020 protests in Seattle. At the time, I was just a normal person out there, being a protester during that time, and what I saw from the Seattle Police Department was pretty extraordinary, and led me to kind of shift a focus in my life from being an architect to becoming a full-time investigative reporter, mostly focused on the Seattle Police Department. But as we'll see here, that thread with the Seattle Police Department has led across the world to Israel.
Absolutely, yeah. And so with that, I guess we'll get straight into the piece that you wrote. Before I start asking you about kind of the specific Seattle officials and individuals that are part of this story, I just wanted to ask first, what inspired you to start looking into this story specifically? What kind of led you to it?
Yeah, after October 7th, 2023, when the Israelis really started escalating extraordinary violence that has turned into a genocide in Gaza, there was also escalating Israeli violence in the West Bank as well. And, maybe early in October, there were videos coming out of the West Bank showing Israeli security forces essentially attacking journalists. There was one video where an IDF soldier pointed his assault rifle at a photojournalist and then used the end of the weapon to butt the photojournalist in his head. And so I thought that was pretty extraordinary, action by this Israeli soldier. And I knew through, a lot of great work that other reporters have done in Seattle, like Guy Oron, and the Jewish Voice for Peace team with the End the Deadly Exchange, program, that Seattle has had a history of engaging with the Israelis. So I sent a question to Mayor Bruce Harrell asking if these sorts of tactics of attacking the press were tactics that Seattle Police Department was being taught in Israel. And, I received crickets from the mayor's office, and that led me to a series of public records requests made over many months that has kind of slowly culminated, in this story published with Seattle Gay News.
It's interesting because that leads directly into the first question I had for you about the piece, which is this Israeli Security Training Institute, ASTI, and its president, Yisroel Stefansky. Both the organization and this individual are quite integral to the story that you wrote. Would you be able to talk to us about what the ASTI does and who Yisroel Stefansky is as a person?
Yeah. So ASTI is the latest iteration in a series of companies and nonprofits run by Yisroel Stefansky within the United States. before ASTI, there was another company run by Yisroel Stefansky called Proactive Global Security, and numerous, I believe, 4 Seattle police officers received training by Proactive Global Security in 2013 and 2014. That company, that was a for-profit company run by Yisroel Stefansky. And around that same time that Proactive Global Security was started, Yisroel Stefansky was also cultivating ties with evangelicals within Washington State, and also running evangelical Christian tours within Israel for church groups from Washington State. So Yisroel Stefansky himself, from what I can tell, is a former volunteer with Zaka, which is an Israeli kind of disaster response agency, an all-volunteer agency that responds to scenes of disaster or attack, and is responsible for retrieving the body parts of deceased individuals. So Yisroel Stefansky was actually a spokesperson for this Zaka organization. And it's really important to highlight here that Zaka as an organization is integral to the Israeli state propaganda apparatus, and explicitly so in some of their old documentation or old records that I've been able to find. And Israeli officials have said as much, all the way up to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu congratulating Zaka on their role of, spreading misinformation or disinformation after October 7th. So Yisroel Stefansky has a lot of connections, specifically with the Israeli state security apparatus. In this piece, I mentioned that Yisroel Stefansky and ASTI brought a former official with the Shin Bet, which is essentially the kind of Israeli equivalent of a hybrid between the FBI and the CIA. Shin Bet, also known as the Israel Security Agency. This is an organization that, when you see journalists killed in Gaza and the kind of Israeli state propaganda that's put out, you see an ISA or a Shin Bet stamp on that propaganda, calling these journalists terrorists. You see the Shin Bet stamp on leaflets that are dropped from Israeli aircraft over Gaza, tell Palestinians, are forcing Palestinians to move throughout the Gaza Strip. So, Yisroel Stefansky himself has very high level ties to the Israeli state security apparatus, or former officials with the Israeli state security apparatus, and this organization Zaka, which he was a former volunteer with. Within the United States, it appears, almost a decade ago, he started cultivating ties in Washington State with various law enforcement contacts in Seattle, and also in other cities, across Washington State, from Tacoma to Bellevue, and in other counties. So fast forward to where we are today, and Yisroel Stefansky is, kind of the president and operating this organization called the Advanced Security Training Institute, also known as ASTI. And this is the organization that we kind of honed in on in this Seattle Gay News piece, that we're talking about today.
Yeah. Thank you so much for giving us the context to this. I think, you know, we as a newspaper only have so much space to share all of the, details and information. So I think it's really valuable that folks kind of know the context of who Stefansky is and his organization, and what they're doing. As we get into now the proper piece, I wanted to ask you about Curry Mayer and the LinkedIn messages that she was having with Stefansky. Could you walk us through that process? You were able to obtain some of the messages from the city, but
Yeah.
they declined to share all of that. What exactly went down there?
Yeah. So, it appears from what I can tell that Yisroel Stefansky cultivated ties with Curry Mayer potentially while she was working with the city of Bellevue. And before she was the director of the Office of Emergency Management, Curry Mayer worked at the city of Bellevue as well. So she then moved to the city of Seattle, became the director of the Office of Emergency Management. And with that, her ties with Yisroel Stefansky came with her. So what I've been able to find is that, Yisroel Stefansky and Curry Mayer have exchanged messages on LinkedIn with each other. However, the city of Seattle will only disclose a certain number of those messages. The other messages have been withheld from public view under the guise that they're private messages exchanged between individuals outside the scope of the city of Seattle employment. And when I asked Curry Mayer directly and the Office of Emergency Management if they would be willing to be transparent and just disclose all of Curry Mayer's messages with Yisroel Stefansky. And they did not respond to that request. So, I think it's a little bit extraordinary here that, with what we're going to get into and what we've found, that the Office of Emergency Management is not really being fully transparent with the links that are happening behind the scenes between Stefansky and Curry Mayer. What we're seeing here is messages, where Stefansky is calling Curry Mayer my dear friend. I believe he's offering to, bring her gifts from Israel, something that would be potentially a violation of city ethics laws. And what we're seeing is kind of at a basic level, just also coordination of Stefansky's trip to Seattle and the coordination of this lecture from this former Shin Bet official, which happened at Seattle City Hall in 2022.
This episode is sponsored by Seattle Gay News. If you didn't know, we're the third oldest queer newspaper in the country, having provided the latest ongoings in our local community for over 50 years. We've gone through a lot of turmoil in the past, covering the AIDS crisis, the recession of '08, among many other challenges. But right now, however, we're going through an unprecedented period where companies that previously advertised with us have withdrawn their support in their finances. We're under more stress to keep the lights on than we've ever been before, which is a shame as this is coinciding with a new wave of trans, non-binary, and genderqueer leaders coming into our newsroom and creating great work with us. We want to be a bridge for the next generation of queer journalists. And with your support, we can achieve that mission and reach our fullest potential, creating more stories, art, and culture for King County locals in the process. We'd love for you to donate if you can. But even if you don't have much to give, simply checking on our website every week and reading the work of our incredible journalists, that'll help us sustain the next 2, 5, 10 years of our future. Simply go to www.sgn.org. Once again, that's www.sgn.org to read the best from a local queer institution.
So, transitioning to another social. I don't know if LinkedIn counts as a social media platform,
I
but
think it does.
uh, yeah, like social media for like folks working on their resumes and their like career, right? But the piece then goes on to ASTI's X account. And so you went through and collected before the likes tab of X was taken away with Elon Musk and everything. You were able to compile quite a few of these anti-LGBT, anti-immigrant, anti-BLM posts that ASTI was liking. Would you be able to explain to folks why that's significant that this organization is liking all of this content? Um,
Yeah, yeah. You used to be able to, go on Twitter and review the posts that an account had liked. And so shortly after, we had tracked that ASTI was this organization that we wanted to look into, we started reviewing these liked posts that ASTI had liked on Twitter or X. And what we had found here, and I think maybe some of them are being pulled up here on the screen, is really a potpourri of conspiracy content, of right-wing content. A number of these posts, kind of stand out. One of these posts calling the murder trial of Derek Chauvin, who murdered George Floyd, a quote, absolute sham, end quote. This organization that's training American law enforcement is engaging with conspiracy content, is engaging with content that is, vehemently anti-LGBTQ. We see content on here talking about locking up all Democrats. We see content about, banning pride flags, banning Black Lives Matter flags, calling Trans Day of Visibility a quote, fucking joke, end quote. So these, at least in my mind, it raises a lot of questions about why an organization training law enforcement is so engaged at such a deep level with content that is so discriminatory in nature.
I wanted to transition to the Ed Murray trip. So,
Yeah.
for folks who are unfamiliar, the former mayor of Seattle, Ed Murray, had a delegation go to Israel in 2015. Would you be able to kind of walk us through Ed Murray's trip and how Yisroel Stefansky ends up being involved in that?
Yeah. So, we're talking a decade ago. Former Mayor Ed Murray, took this trip that, at the time activists called a pink washing trip. And the idea with pink washing is that the Israeli government is aiming to cultivate positive relationships with a number of different groups around the world, to create a positive image of Israel. And, so this trip was labeled kind of a pink washing trip by activists at the time. And the idea is that, in expose or, kind of using a pro-gay image of Israel, that the state of Israel would be able to distract the public from, systemic human rights abuses against Palestinians. So, at the time, the media, Seattle media was covering Ed Murray's trip. There was a lot of reporting on it. But what was not reported was that, behind the scenes, the city was aiming to engage in knowledge sharing, quote unquote, with the Israeli security apparatus. Another thing that was not reported at the time was that Yisroel Stefansky, who was training Seattle police just a year earlier, somehow found his way into this delegation and was giving tours of Seattle Fire Department personnel, around Jerusalem and around Tel Aviv. I want to highlight maybe a couple things about Ed Murray's trip and tie them 10 years later to where we are today. At the time, the planners of this trip were preparing a meeting between Ed Murray's delegation and an Israeli lawyer for the IDF, Tal Becker. That meeting never ended up happening. It wasn't part of the final trip that Murray took in Israel. But it's important to highlight because 10 years later today, Tal Becker, that same lawyer that Ed Murray was planning on meeting in Israel, is now in The Hague defending Israel against claims of genocide that have been legally brought against the country by South Africa at the International Court of Justice. And the second point I wanted to kind of highlight about Ed Murray's trip to Israel is his engagement with the kind of technology sector in Israel, and specifically, highlighting Ed Murray's engagement with Microsoft and the Microsoft Development Center in Israel. And as we look 10 years after that trip, there's been a lot of reporting by The Guardian and 972 magazine about Microsoft's role coordinating and handling Israeli state surveillance programs, specifically the monumental amount of data that the Israeli state security apparatus collects on Palestinians day after day. And we're talking about, hundreds of millions of calls that are surveilled and recorded. There's been also a lot of reporting by 972 magazine about how the Israelis intercept calls and specifically target gay Palestinians or queer Palestinians and aim to blackmail them in order to turn them into informants or in order to obtain information about their family members in Palestine. So, these relationships between Israel, Microsoft, the technology sector, the city of Seattle, they've all been cultivated for, what we're seeing a decade or more. And the fruits of those cultivated relationships are shown in front of us today with, forcible transfer of Palestinians and this monumental surveillance apparatus, which, is being used to justify, the killing of journalists, of women, children, and an overwhelming majority of civilians in Gaza and in the West Bank.
Carmen Best. So Carmen Best, she was then deputy chief of police for the Seattle Police Department and went to Israel to do a training with the Anti-Defamation League. Is that correct?
Yeah. So shortly after Ed Murray returned from this 2015 trip to Israel, Carmen Best signed up for a trip of her own to Israel with the Anti-Defamation League. ASTI asked her to go to Israel, I believe, a couple more times with their program. There are other entities involved here too that are also aiming to create these relationships and these ties between the city of Seattle and Israel, and specifically the Beersheba Sister City program, which also invited Carmen Best to Israel again in 2018, specifically with the opportunity to meet her, quote unquote, counterparts in the Israeli National Police. So, I think we can see a kind of snowballing of relationships that are continually aiming to cultivate these ties and these favorable links between the city of Seattle and the Israeli government and the Israeli state kind of security apparatus.
For sure. Yeah. And so with that, I would like to kind of end this conversation with another official who I think, at least for me, I think the individual that I found the most that stood out to me was Deputy Chief of the Fire Department, Jay Hagan. Um, in piece, you've collected several documents of Jay Hagan's relationship with Stefansky. Um, so I would like to ask you directly about a couple of these things because I find them so interesting. One
Yeah.
is that so Stefansky, well, the mayor of Tel Aviv comes to visit Seattle, right? I'm forgetting what year that was, but
2015, right after Ed Murray goes to Israel, he comes back, and then the mayor of Tel Aviv comes to Seattle to meet Ed Murray again.
Gotcha. So during this time, we have the email that Jay Hagan ends up sharing need-to-know basis information with Stefansky. And if I'm not mistaken, Stefansky is not a government official of Israel or anything, right? He's not like an official part of that delegation, is he?
Not to my knowledge, and I apologize for the sirens going outside. I don't know if you can hear them.
No worries.
Not to my knowledge that Stefansky is a government an employee of the Israeli government, but it is pretty extraordinary that a high-ranking city of Seattle official would share need-to-know basis information with a private individual. It does raise questions about why that information was shared and what this relationship was between Hagan and Stefansky at the time.
Yeah, so we're pulling up some documents here, some of the emails that Jay Hagan had with Stefansky. So let's just kind of walk through the two that are on the screen right now. Earlier, you had mentioned that Stefansky had offered gifts to Curry Mayor. You can see here that he also did that with Jay Hagan, offering olive oil and wine from Israel, coming to visit in Seattle. But I think that this one on the right is, I think, particularly interesting. So Jay Hagan has a daughter, and this daughter goes to visit Israel on a trip. And from the email exchanges that we see between Jay Hagan and Stefansky, it looks like that he is hosting or yeah, it looks like he's actually hosting the daughter. Would you be able to talk to us a bit about that email exchange?
Yeah, and I don't know more than what we're seeing here in front of us from this exchange, so I don't necessarily want to speculate on exactly what happened here, but I do think it's pretty, these emails show something kind of extraordinary in that Stefansky is really cultivating these highly personal, highly private relationships with city officials, and he's doing that aiming to connect with their own family members, and he's doing that by offering gifts, olive oil, wine from Israel. And I think what's the intent of cultivating these relationships with city officials? That's something we don't necessarily know, but we do see is continually a pattern with Stefansky when you're looking at Curry Mayor and when you're looking at Jay Hagan here. the highly personal nature of these conversations with someone who is so close with the Israeli state security apparatus and who's cultivating these relationships that are highly embedded within Seattle government and the kind of confidential nature and the security nature of how the Seattle government itself operates. One of the largest cities on the West Coast and a huge transit hub, a huge technology center. We have the Port of Seattle. So we don't necessarily know why these relationships are being cultivated in this way, but what we're seeing is that they're resulting in kind of this highly favorable light or favorable lens that Stefansky is cultivating for himself with Seattle officials.
Absolutely. So yeah, we're about wrapping up here with the interview. There were, of course, some things in the piece that we did not touch on today. Professor Spades has a whole section sharing their thoughts. As we're wrapping up, is there anything you would like to share? Any final words or feelings before we end the show today?
Yeah, I think again, I'm really thankful for Seattle Gay News, for this conversation and also for investing in in this kind of enterprise investigative reporting. It's rare and it's desperately needed. So, go Seattle Gay News. But I also think it's important to highlight the lack of transparency, specifically with the Seattle Police Department and with the Seattle Office of Emergency Management. Both of those city departments did not respond to questions, which is pretty extraordinary. That when we're talking about, the Seattle Police Department, this is an agency that, is able to kill people, is able to shut down First Amendment activity. This is an agency that the public really should be putting a spotlight on. And when they refuse to answer questions about training or potential training or engagement with an individual or an entity that espouses anti-LGBT or anti-immigrant or conspiracy theory content, it does not bode well for public confidence in these agencies, and the continual pattern of non-response to questions that are aiming to kind of liberate information for the public, I think should be concerning to everyone.
SGN, we're so grateful that you came to us with this piece, and we're so happy to give you a platform to be able to report on this very important issue. Yeah, we genuinely care about, the safety and well-being of the people here in the city of Seattle and the region. So when our elected officials are implicated in something like this and they're not being transparent, we need to be a source that, calls attention to it so we can make sure that if anything is happening, we're holding folks accountable. We're giving them an opportunity to speak on it, and hopefully we improve. So yeah, thank you so much, Glen, for coming on and speaking to us today on our second episode of this new podcast. You can, of course, find Glen's piece in both our imprint issue for the month of August, as well as on our website at sgn.org. And yeah, we'll speak to y'all next time.